Hi, I'm Jane. This is Charmaine. Charmaine Craig works at UC Riverside. She is the author of one previous novel called The Good Men that came out in 2002. A couple of years ago, I met Charmaine. We started chatting about this book and what she was writing about, and I thought it was incredibly fascinating. And I was really pleased when it came out. But I was a little intimidated, you know. I thought, okay, lots of authors have incredibly fascinating ideas, and then you open it up and, but I love this book. I think it's a wonderful book, and it was me that talked Ted into doing this talk, because I think this book really needs an audience. It not only deserves an audience, but an audience will love it. The early reviews have been fabulous. This morning she had, there was an interview in the LA Times that talks a lot about the history and the political issues of the book. We won't touch on that too much, but we'll talk a little bit about it. But what really interests me is how she made this book and how she made it really come alive and how she made it mean something to me, someone who knows nothing about these events. And I think that's it's really wonderful and skillful and fabulous thing to do. So I highly recommend it. And Charmaine is going to tell you a little bit about the setting or the setup, and then she's going to do a reading, and then we'll have our conversation.
Thank you, Jane. Jane suggested I start by reading about 5 or 7 minutes from the book. And what I'm going to read takes place about 200 pages in. The two main characters, or three, of the book are based on my family members. Benny and Kin are the names of my mother's parents, and they were a mixed-race couple, both minorities living in Burma. When they met, they couldn't speak the same language. And I won't go into too many details about the story right now, but they met during the last days of the colonial era, and soon World War II erupted, and Benny was twice captured by the Japanese. And some of what he saw led him to become very invested in the plight of my grandmother's, or the character based on my grandmother's people, the Karen, which are one of Burma's largest ethnic minority groups and long persecuted peoples. And after World War II, Benny ends up becoming an architect of the Karen Revolution, which in fact became the longest running civil war in recorded history. And he was soon disappeared. My grandfather was really disappeared, and the character Benny has disappeared, and Kin goes on to hide her children in the jungle for 3 years, not knowing during this time if Benny's alive or dead, doing everything she can to keep her children alive, trading in peanut oil and rolled cigarettes, often being separated for long stretches of time from her children, and taking consolation in other men. And when they finally come together again after 3 years, what was already sort of a strained marriage between them becomes marked by really deep alienation. It's very difficult for them to overcome what they've been through. Benny is soon thrown into house arrest, and then things become even tougher when they're sort of locked into the same house. And so what I'm going to read you takes place about 3 years after Benny's house arrest. Their daughter Louisa, their eldest daughter Louisa, who's based on my mother, Kin has recently been doing what she can, campaigning to make Louisa Miss Burma for political reasons. And Benny is really appalled by this idea, and that has only strained the marriage more. So what's just happened, sorry that's a lot of setup, what's just happened is that Kin this morning has taken Louisa to the stadium where she will be, where the pageant will occur, the Miss Burma pageant. And Benny, who again is under house arrest and hasn't been out of his home for 3 years, is being escorted to the stadium by a soldier in an army truck. So they're in the truck now and approaching where the pageant will take place. Evening was falling by the time they approached the central railway station. Already a crowd was overcoming the road leading to the stadium that had been named for Burma's liberator and protector of the populace, Aung San. Looking out his window at the commotion, Benny had the strange impression of taking in alternately a collection of individuals, a mother tugging at the hand of a young child, a delicate man hawking snacks, a police officer sectioning off a side street, a legless girl being wheeled along by a dog, and a collective force. The urgency and excitement in the air were undeniable, and in spite of his own cynicism, and in spite of the armed soldiers patrolling the road up ahead, Benny felt the tug of elation. It was breathtaking, the vision of this panoply of peoples, young and old, able-bodied and destitute, blameless and criminal, all taking possession of the streets. It was also irrational and oddly undemocratic, this impulse of thousands to catch a glimpse of whoever was crowned. The poorest among them wouldn't possibly be able to pay for even the cheapest tickets. But there was nothing rational or democratic about beauty itself, Benny told himself. And still, beauty was not classist or racist. From the looks of it, these people were prepared to adore whichever girl of whichever origins became their queen. Perhaps beauty alone had the power to transfigure people so. And yet, Benny reminded himself with a shudder, there was something insidious about beautifying the country's image by means of a girl, whatever her background. For somewhere in the darkness beyond the Delta, innocent people continued to be shot and killed. Half a block from the stadium, the truck came to a stop beside a jeep, where 2 soldiers were waiting to escort Benny through the overspill of would-be spectators surging from the station. The narrowing evening was giving way to a deeper darkness, heightening the assault of sights and sounds and smells on Benny's desensitized soul. Soon he was marshaled past a throng of beggars, being rebuffed by a guard, through a stadium gate, into a tunnel, and out into an arena where, in the shadows of an enormous stage that had been erected, he discovered Kin, seated in the lower section of the packed stands. She claimed him with a look of relief as he stumbled toward her along the narrow aisle, and he was overcome by a feeling of belonging, of being bound to her by years of experience. How easily he'd forgotten the powerful pleasure she'd so willingly given him, the sensual offering of loyalty and children, intoxicating not just their early years, but all the years until his imprisonment, years when they had given themselves over to the lives they'd remade in order to be together. Now, approaching her, he seemed to see every one of their children's faces in her own still lovely one. And when he sat on the hard bench between her and a heavy-set man, and she leaned in to say something in his ear, he was immediately comforted by the familiar sound of her voice and by the clean scent she was wearing, undercut by her own almost undetectable deeper fragrance. That feeling of renewed appreciation for his wife, of closeness with her, only grew when at last the stadium lights went dim, and a hush came over the assembled thousands, and sweet music began to sound over the loudspeaker. It wasn't long before yellow floodlights shot up from the stage, and then a procession of bathing costumed girls appeared before them. Many of these girls, he saw with a pang of sympathy, were too heavily made up. Most wore smiles that were too theatrical, some tottered and swung their hips, as though to impersonate feminine competence and magnetism. Others cast defeated glances at the audience or blinked out at the darkness as if to find reassurance there. Then Louisa emerged, in a simple white suit, and it was as if a switch were thrown. And was some amplification of lighting responsible for her skin appearing so luminous? Her smile seemed to reach out past him and across the stadium, to reach out as if to fling the gates open and let everyone in. Who was this creature? He was still asking himself a quarter hour later, when Louisa was invited to present herself uniquely to the judges. Who had taught her to move on those gold heels, not cheaply or brashly, not frantically? No, there wasn't a tense or unnatural note in the way she fell into a smile, cast her eyes over the stands, turned, looked with another unabashed glance back at the audience. Here rather was a young woman radiant with self-possession. Yes, This was precisely what distinguished her from the rest, not the mechanics of her beauty, the way her eyes were set above the sculpture of her cheekbones, or the voluptuousness that Benny preferred not to notice. All of these girls were knockouts, mechanically speaking. Rather, what distinguished her was what she did with her looks, disregarded them, so that the outer luminosity gave way to a more resplendent inner one. Wasn't it a truism that a virtue was a virtue only by dint of its keeper's unconsciousness of it? And didn't she seem to be unself-consciousness made manifest? A sort of heavenly body obediently prepared to shine on for the others, spinning and circling around her composure, until the light of that composure must finally perish. I give you my light, she seemed to communicate, that you might have a measure of grace. I give you my naturalness, that you might see a simpler, more natural life, one unspotted by the shadows of divisiveness. Yes, I have the blood of various peoples coursing through my veins, but what of it? We are all various. Don't despair. Stop these arguments. Content yourself with enchantment.
Thank you. So, how old is Louisa at this point?
She's 15.
So, she's 15. So, one of the things I think is interesting about Louisa from when we first meet her is that she's very aware of her family and she's very aware of her parents. Mm-hmm. And she has a lot of self-confidence. That's been my experience of oldest daughters, too. And she really does feel as if she could fix their relationship if only they would let her. And I love the way when she comes on the stage, she has that composure that she's learned from having such a difficult childhood. The other thing that's interesting from our perspective is that Benny and Kin are only 18 and 19 when they meet. So they set off on this this marital and eventually, much more courageous journey than that, when they're just what we would consider kids. So, did you get the information that you needed to spur your inspiration from family conversations? Did you grow up knowing these things, or did you have to find out?
A little bit of both. My dad was a real storyteller and a Don Quixote type character, truly, as some of you here know. And he really didn't shy away from describing my mother in mythical terms to me when I was starting from really as far back as I can remember. Mm-hmm. He certainly featured the fact that she was Miss Burma and one of the most famous actresses in Miss Burma, and that she had been a woman warrior, and that her first husband had been assassinated during peace talks with a military regime. But he also didn't shy away from telling me in glamorized terms stories of sort of horrific stories of the torture her father went through, or the way that she had lost an infant baby. What was missing from all of this sort of grandiose story were sort of what I might say called the toll all of this took on my grandparents and on my mother. Mm-hmm. And the flip side of that is when I began to interview my mother for this book, she knew I wanted to write it. And for 2 years, quite a long time ago now, years before she passed away, I interviewed her, and she generously told me as many of the details as she could remember, but again, missing from her stories were sort of the inner life, the pain, the shame,
So she told you about events,
exactly,
and people that she knew, but she didn't tell you how she felt during these things that happened.
How she felt, or even what motivated her, for example, to really, she couldn't talk that much about what motivated her to become Miss Burma or to allow herself to enter this realm or even to take up arms. It was as if fate were pulling her along. And I think probably that's how she experienced a lot of it. It was necessity. But the thing is, that doesn't make a novel, as you know.
Yeah. So one of the things about Kin is, and maybe Benny too, but especially about Kin, is she too is very reserved about her feelings. And is that a characteristic of Karen culture, to be, you know, reserved and keep your feelings to yourself? And do you think?
Absolutely. My mother told me there were many times when she was telling me about what had happened to her. And I would, for example, I mentioned already that when she was a child, she was separated from her mother for months and months at a time, and separated from her father for 3 years. And there was one moment when her mother had thought she had a lead about where the father might be, and she had left the children in a town, and while she was gone, the town was invaded. And soldiers had in fact, my mother, who was only 9 at the time, and her younger siblings, all kind of crouched around the door and looked through the door, and they saw soldiers with their bloody knives going from house to house and just murdering people. And the soldiers came into the house, and I won't tell you what comes next, but
It's in here,
my grandmother, word reached my grandmother that my mother had been slain. The rest of the children had lived, but my mother had been slain. And I asked, what was it like when she saw you again? Because she eventually found them, not where she'd left them, but in another town. And I said, did she embrace you? Did she cry? And she said she just stood looking at me, and I could see on her face how relieved she was, but she never said anything. She never made a gesture. It was just a kind of stoic. I think they had to be that way in some ways to survive, but it certainly is cultural as well, not to show their feelings.
Well, yes, and you have the feeling as you're reading the book that events are just overwhelming. So the events go from let's say not the events, but the world that they live in goes from being very quiet, you know, they're sitting in their house, they're fine, and then it's chaos, and then it goes back to being very quiet. So you can see that in some ways, they have no time for post-traumatic stress.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
They have to just keep on going.
And that was the way my mother lived, and my grandfather. One of his mantras was never look back. And I think from my mother, an implicit one was, don't look inward too much. One of the interviews, she said, if I look in too much, I'll have to make a decision. And I said, a decision about what? And she said, if I stay here or if I go back. And she was living in a tension, and I guess we're moving into the political, but between her commitments to motherhood and I think her commitments to a people whom she'd left. But I think even more than that, belonging was on the table. To whom did she belong? Not only in terms of the cause of motherhood versus the cause of a people, but belonging in the way that we belong to those who understand our sort of the tacit cultural codes. And for a long time in my childhood, I felt that she didn't necessarily feel she belonged here with these codes. And that, of course, made me feel that I didn't entirely belong to her.
So when she moved to the U.S., did she move to L.A.?
First to New York City.
First to New York
City. Which was
City.
shocking. Lincoln Towers, I think, way up high, away from the ground.
And then to LA.
And then after I was born, about 3 months after I was born, my parents came west to California and soon Los Angeles.
And so do you think that they found that to be a more welcoming environment?
Absolutely,
than New
yes.
York? Huh.
Yes, they both said that they felt much more accepted in California and Los Angeles. There was a way in which my mother felt that New York City, that she had come from a culture where she had felt, yes, she was, in the last years of her life in Burma, she was a soldier and always on the run and being hunted. And yet she told me she had never felt as protected and cherished, ever, as she felt during those years with her soldiers. And when she came to New York City, she felt that if she were to pass out in the street, people would just walk over her. And so that was something that was so shocking and dislocating. And when she came here, somehow that got better.
But the book, Miss Burma, ends when she leaves Burma, so that part we don't get to explore.
Right.
We mostly explore Benny and Kin and their family life and their life with the children, and also includes their housemaid, whose name I can't know.
Tata.
Tata, and her child, and her child is the child of rape. And this, I think one of the things that amazes me about this book is that I or some author, maybe from the US, would have made all of these horrible things that happened to them extremely dramatic and sort of shocking. But it can't be that way because so many things happen, and they have to incorporate so many things. And so the feeling that comes when you're reading the book is a feeling of events evolving, and you witnessing how the characters are responding to the events, and yet the events just keep on going. I believe I mentioned the interview in the LA Times today, but one of the things you said in the Times that I thought was interesting was that you hesitated to write a historical novel, but your first novel was a historical novel.
And that's why I hesitated to write a historical novel.
And that one was set in the Middle Ages. And having done that myself, I wonder why you hesitated.
I think that, I don't know if you've experienced this, Jane, and I'd be really interested to hear if you have, but I feel like among the sort of literati, there's a real bias against the historical novel, the political novel. And I think because I'm not only a woman, but a woman of sort of mixed race, I guess, there's the expectation that I'll be writing kind of the immigrant story that looks like a certain thing, perhaps the Disney-esque, orientalizing, orchid-strewn, woman warrior, version of this story. And I really didn't want to do that. Yeah, Mulan.
I like Mulan.
Yeah.
Mulan had a horse, was her best friend. What could be wrong with that, right?
My mother had an elephant, so could have done that. Yeah.
So keep going.
Well, just I so didn't want to do that I went the opposite direction initially, and I wrote a whole different book, which started in really took place in 2010, and was a mother-daughter story, and I was the daughter, or character like me. I would put it in close to the genre of autofiction. Because I sort of wanted to write something more au courant and more psychological, and more about this issue of belonging that I mentioned. And what became clear to me after my mother died, and there was this vacuum not only in my life, but I think in the world of Burma activism, was that I realized how adolescent for me that book was. It really was, I needed to get myself out of the picture and be a lot more empathic and sort of accept the duty of telling the story of Burma and the Karen people. And that also meant looking at the lives of my grandparents, who really had been, particularly my grandfather, a key figure in the story of the Karen people.
Well, I actually love historical novels, and I love to read them, and I really, truly love to write them. I think the ones that I have enjoyed writing the most have been the historical novels. They have been in some ways, well, one was incredibly difficult, that was Private Life, and one was as easy as pie, and that was The Greenlanders. And all I had to do was put on my bearskin rug and go for it. And I really enjoyed that feeling of it being sort of carried into my mind from far, far away. That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
But I also think historical novels are I don't know what literati say because I don't hang out with any literati. And my literary principle has been do what you want. And, but I think one of the things that historical novels do is that they remind us how we got where we are. And we can't do without them. And all novels turn into historical novels anyway, so.
That's true. Yeah.
So I really love historical novels, and that's one of the things I really like about this because I'm not going to draw any parallels with current events, but I am going to say that that sense of chaos, that sense of people living through chaos and trying to make their lives in a world that is falling apart and being rebuilt and falling apart and being rebuilt is something we need to read about and to know. So which of the characters did you find the most difficult to get inside of?
Well, I think the character of my mother is the truth of it.
Really, more so than Benny?
Oh, yes.
And why was that?
Because she's closer to me. I think that one of the appeals for me of historical fiction is that I have an easier time. My imagination is sort of instigated when it's farther away from me in time and place. I'm more interested in leaning into attentively the other than I am looking at myself. And probably just the character of Louisa was, I knew her too well, perhaps, and so to get past my allegiance to my mother and turn Louisa into a character was much more difficult.
And how about Kin? Because Kin is so quiet, and yet she is a very vivid character. There's a little section I really would like to read about her. I talked her into reading this.
I haven't practiced reading this, so we'll see how this goes. Should I really read this?
Absolutely. If you don't, I will.
I don't know if I should really read the whole thing. Okay, well, how many minutes do you want me to? You'll cut me off.
I'll cut you off.
I guess I have to set this up too. So I mentioned that the family is torn apart at the beginning of the Civil War, and soon Kin has to take the children on a trek up to a very remote part of the jungle, and she ends up leaving them there, the children, and out of necessity, and venturing to another place where the Karens are now in control of this place, and she thinks she'll set up a life for the children. So she has just made the journey down a mountain to a river, or she's making that journey now. And I'm going to sort of cut in to the bottom of a section and then keep reading. She's been thinking about the children. Now the thought of those children made her stand up from the bank, and she turned, as though to turn her back on them. She was 28 and had already tolerated so many sorrows, so many terrors. She could not now confront another. She must only find a way for her family to endure. And as she followed the Karens, who had begun to wander down the darkening mountain again, doomed as all Karens were to wander and wander, she moved swiftly through the gnarled landscape with a feeling of unburdening herself of her load. The Belin River was peaceful and green in the fading light when she arrived at the west bank, where a makeshift camp with temporary barracks and a mess had been erected for the soldiers and refugees. Exhausted, she gratefully accepted a bowl of rice and fish paste, then went out to sit alone under the trees, bending with the breeze on the bank. She couldn't yet pretend to be comfortable visiting with others, even when she gleaned the extent of their further suffering. Such visiting still felt like a betrayal of those she'd left behind, and of Benny. But as she was raising the first mouthful of warm rice to her lips, she glanced up the bank and saw a soldier she'd last seen in Cooley. He was sitting alone beside a campfire playing a harmonica. Linton, that was his name, she remembered. He'd been passing through Cooley on his way to join the Karen levies in the war effort. She's referring to World War II. And for some reason, several men in the village had questioned his allegiances. Even then, she'd found his quick, sure manner and laughing poise to be riveting. He was also troublingly good-looking, and at least a few years younger than she was. As if sensing her stare, he all at once stopped playing and glanced up at her. It was very straightforward, his stare. It made her blush, though she doubted he could see the evidence of her embarrassment from 20 feet away. She gave him a little reluctant smile and looked back down into her bowl of rice, which she suddenly felt self-conscious about consuming alone. The harmonica started up again to cry out the first part of a Karen ballad she hadn't heard since childhood, then stalled. "Join me," she heard his relaxed voice call to her. How ridiculously false her response, of surprise, of bewilderment, of hesitation. Soon she was plodding toward him with her bowl, through the mud and a swirl of mosquitoes, the echoes of self-recrimination droning in her ear. Why was she coming like a good puppy at his first command, when all she really wanted was to be left alone? He continued to stare hard at her. There wasn't a trace of Karen modesty about him, was there? Smiling broadly when she sat, and his smile only increased her sense that she must untangle herself from this situation as quickly as she'd ensnared herself in it. "Just who I was hoping to see," he said. But the comment was directed at someone else, at a soldier, a doughy, thick-lipped, smiling boy who lumbered up to the fire with a bulging sack and a pot of water. Linton picked up his harmonica and proceeded to puff out the sad tune again, thoroughly ignoring her and the boy, who went about making his senior's supper, measuring a finger of rice, putting the pot down to boil, pulling an array of mushrooms, bamboo shoots, and fiddle-leaf fern from his sack, along with 2 small birds. Well, she had wanted to be left to her thoughts, hadn't she? And there was something comforting about the respite this togetherness allowed her. She relaxed into a state of merely eating and listening and observing as Linton played, and the boy plucked and cleaned the birds, and then scattered the charred wood, moved the pot to the embers, salted and skewered his spines, stoked the fire, and, with forked branches that he drove into the ground, constructed a stand on which to set Linton's dinner.
So I'm going to stop you. The thing that strikes me about this is that time is passing moment by moment. It's like we're looking here and we're looking there, and there's the detail of the sticks and the detail of the birds and the plucking, and to me that's the hardest part about a historical novel, is getting the time to pass in a way that brings the reader in without going too quickly or being too dry. And a lot of historical novels have a hard time doing that because they're so focused on the history and not how the history felt. And in this case, with Kin, we see not only how the history feels, but also how the landscape feels. And the fact that this guy she just met is a really important guy.
Yeah. He ends up being an important guy.
We don't have the sense of that. We only have the sense of how charming he is, how good looking he is. He's got the harmonica. You know, I can really feel how this young woman is making her way through this life, not knowing what you, the author, know. And it keeps me too from the reader, too, wanting to go on and yet not knowing what I'm heading toward.
I think that for me, the difficult thing in writing scenes, and the thing that I'm most interested perhaps, is getting past what's significant and eventful about the scene, excuse me, and really sort of animating the layers of consciousness, you know, the different kinds of signals that we're receiving from others, and the different kinds of impulses that we experience in the moment, often that are in contention with one another.
Yes, I agree. And the other thing is, she is a mother, and lots of times mothers in novels aren't very complex. And she is extremely complex as a mother. She's smart. She's very attentive toward and fond of her children, but she leaves them behind. She has a vibrant and sometimes wavering sacral life. She has to deal with all these events that are going on, and so she's not a mother. She's a mother and a woman and a person with an inner life, which is pretty rare for a mother in a book. And so that, I think she's very quiet, and she remains quiet, but she still has this kind of fullness to her that I think is really amazing.
One of my ways into her finally was to, I was having a hard time characterizing her, but I realized that the way into her, for me, in fact, my grandmother survived a really terrible thing when she was a child, and and she was therefore rejected very much by her own mother and her sister. And thinking about that and sort of trying to inhabit it allowed me to imagine her, my way into her, and sort of the central question for her is there any point in going on when this kind of atrocity can happen? Sort of the eros and thanatos are as strong in her as anything. And somehow for me, just arriving at that question and the thanatos, the death drive that is as strong as what I knew of her to be a very kind of erotic person, helped me, I think, dignify her with that complexity that you're talking about.
I mean, the way I see every character in here, it gets your respect. Even those shadowy American figures from the CIA, and you know, they have their quirks and they have their one. As I remember, one is quite sweaty, which made me laugh.
Yes. I like that guy.
Perfect. I want him to sweat. So that's one of the things I really was fond about the book, was that it wasn't just that you were sympathetic, it was that you could make them really live right in front of me as if they were sitting there, you know, wiping the sweat off their brow in my room. I quite like that. What did you have to do to be able to evoke the landscape? How much did you have to go there? What did you have to see? Was it partly just stories that you heard that enabled you to evoke the landscape?
I find it so interesting that you and a couple of other people have asked me or mentioned the landscape, because my orientation is so much I'm much more interested in consciousness than I am in any kind of surface or the sort of the trappings of the world. And I think that probably my MO as a fiction writer is just put in the details, the surface details that would be deeply significant to the center of consciousness in the moment. Whatever they would notice, then I would notice. But as far as my research for that, a lot of the details, I'm sure, came from my mother and from those 2 years, because that was the kind of thing that I got a lot of from her.
Yeah.
I have gone a couple of times, and twice only, but I had meaningful time there, and I know that just that visceral experience of being there found its way into the book, I'm sure.
So we're going to have questions in a minute or two, but I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Mr. Francis here last night, which is, what do you think your mother would have thought of this novel?
I think she would be relieved that I finally wrote. She had, let me just back up for a second. She knew I was trying to do this. And she said to me, and she saw me struggling before she died. She saw me struggling, and I think she saw that I wondered if I was going to be able to pull it off. And she said to me, you know, do whatever you want to do. Fictionalize, don't fictionalize, or don't do it. And I think that she would have been really happy, actually, that I finally did it.
That's great.
Yeah.
She should be. I think if my mother knew I was writing a novel about her, she would say, it's about time. So let's have a few questions. More the better.
All right, I'll bring the microphone to anyone who has a question. Just a quick reminder, around here, questions start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are typically short. Only Jane gets to ask follow-up questions, and there is no such thing as a two-part question.
I'm trying to start my question with the right letter, but it's already too late. I haven't read the book, but I have a memory that the Karen people are mostly Buddhist, but there are Christians as well. And I'm wondering what role religion played and whether the Buddhist influence sort of permeates the consciousness of the characters.
That's a wonderful question. So just, the Karens are originally animist. They, animist, meaning, believe in the realm of the spirits. Some of them were converted to Buddhism because the majority race are the Burmans, and they're Buddhist.
Theravada.
Yes. And in the 1800s, American missionaries came over, and a large group of many Karens welcomed them very warmly because the Karen cosmology is very mosaic, in fact. And they tell of, their hands were cut off when they were found with writing implements by the Burman majority. So they lost not only their alphabet, but all of their texts, including their holy book. And their legend was that eventually a white man would bring back their holy book. And so it was a setup, in a way, for them to warmly welcome the Christian missionaries. But one of the things that was really important for me was to subvert some of the expectations of how I, as a sort of, from my post-colonial position, would manage such things as this, and would manage such things as the treatment of colonialism itself. Because from the Karen perspective, they called these Christian missionaries and the Americans their mother, and they called the British colonialists their father. Because, in fact, they really felt that the American missionaries had given them something that was deeply spiritually significant to them, and that the British colonialists had saved them from centuries of enslavement by the Burman majority. So, one of the things that I was constantly thinking about is how can I subvert expectations? Not deliver the Disney, thing, but also not deliver the typical post-colonial narrative. And just to answer your question then, Christianity, these themes that I mentioned, but Christianity is very present in the book. And I take it seriously. And there's some of the characters, a character like Louisa is very conflicted about it because she sees all of this. But there are other characters who are very angry about a typical Western stance that they should be embarrassed about having been missionized.
Very curious about Benny. My father's cousins, Iraqi Jews who were in Burma, ran away when the Japanese came, so they lived in England. Benny would be their same age. I discussed, Joni, your age and how old your grandfather would be. Why did he stay, and what happened to his family? Do you have any idea where they were from, where they went to?
Yes. My grandfather's one side of the family was from Iraq and Kurdistan. Could have been the same family. Another side of the family had fled Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition and they'd all come through India before they landed in Burma. My grandfather's grandfather was the rabbi of the synagogue of Rangoon. And you're right that most of them fled by necessity, almost all of them, if not all of them, during the Japanese invasion, many of them dying en route to India. My grandfather was granted permission. He was a British officer in the customs service at the time, and he was granted permission to leave, and he begged my grandmother to leave with him on this journey to India. And my grandmother, who was so sensitive about being a minority and so kind of had been so oppressed already in Burma, said, probably smartly so, I'll be even more of a minority in India. And in fact, not the white people, but there was a whole ranking system of the people, the refugees in India. And so he refused to leave her. And they instead went and hid in a Karen village. That's being in the story because he was apprehended there. But
So we are from the same origin.
yes.
I have not read the book, but you talk about a beauty pageant. That seems at odds with this whole story. Can you explain any of that?
A beauty pageant, yes. Well, I had to have a beauty pageant because my mother was, in fact, probably should have mentioned this before, Burma's first national beauty queen. And so I knew there had to be a beauty pageant. But the challenge was how to treat beauty and sort of the beauty pageant itself in an unexpected way, and how to even perhaps dignify beauty. So Jane, you talked a little bit about the representation of Louisa as strong and having self-possession, and one of my ways that I tried to dignify Louisa's beauty is by focusing first on that self-possession and that almost spiritual strength and beauty that she had.
But what's interesting is what's a little more interesting, I think, is what she has to put up with afterwards. Once she's become this icon, this national icon, I'm not going to say what she has to put up, but I found it shocking. You know, it wasn't the same thing that happened to Miss Georgia in 1956.
Yeah.
I thought that too was a very insightful way of talking about the extremely volatile nature of politics in the world that she lives in, and how to become Miss Burma is not simply the shallow thing that it is to become Miss America. It's a very fraught role that she has to undertake when she's 15 years old. Mm-hmm. It's really something.
Yeah, I was viscerally reminded of that just today or yesterday when somebody shared a comment. I'd written an essay about my mother that was published in Literary Hub, and someone shared a comment from there with me in which a Burman, someone from the ethnic majority race, had said, the heroine Louisa Benson is not a heroine. She was raped many times, and she slept with many men, and she has HPV, and blah, blah, blah. And I realized, I just thought, this is what she went through.
Yeah.
This is exactly what she
trolling,
went through.
constant trolling of a physical nature as well as a gossipy nature. That's another thing that I love. You know, when I teach writing and teach the novel, I always talk about one of the great aspects of the novel, or one of the great parts of the novel is gossip. And I love that about the novel. And this novel is just rolls on gossip, because that's the only way they have to communicate. Mm-hmm. And they're so aware that it's not reliable, and yet they have to deal with it anyway. It's fascinating.
And it's still so potent.
Yeah.
Even if it's unreliable.
Yeah. Somebody else. Here's one. Yes.
Charmaine, I'm wondering, in the course of writing the book, was there anything that you were surprised to discover about your mother?
I don't know if there was anything I was surprised to discover, but what I was surprised by is, and sort of blindsided by, were moments when I felt as if I were finally understanding what she had gone through. Putting pieces together, for example, that she sort of just barely alluded to. So one example of that is I had known her husband was assassinated. There had been some mention that perhaps he was in dialogue with the CIA, and he was organizing perhaps a pro-democratic, pan-ethnic opposition force. And when I dug into this there was nothing in scholarly literature at all about it. So I had to go through declassified CIA documents. And in fact, I learned that not only was the CIA in dialogue with Karen forces and other pro-democratic forces that were insurgent forces, but that the State Department at the same time was really assisting the Burman government in liquidating the ethnic groups, the same forces. That kind of thing, it wasn't as if I was necessarily learning something about my mother, but I suddenly realized what she was protecting me from, perhaps, or what she was, just how complicated the dynamics were that she lived through. And also just by meditating so much on her past life, on her childhood, on her relationship with this first husband, I would find myself really overcome and feeling as if I was almost living her past. And so it almost felt like I knew my mother better than I could have ever known her before. I know that might sound a little silly, but it's really what it felt like.
Sorry, I haven't read the book, but I did spend a couple weeks with the Karen people in northern Thailand, and I thought that their lack of emotion or unemotional repressed state, after a while I realized that it was more like fatalistic, like whatever happened, like when the grandmother came back in the village and saw the kids, it's like, oh, here you are, like this was predetermined. Do you think that your mother really exhibited more fatalism or just a desire not to deal with her emotions?
I wouldn't call it fatalism with my mother. She was stoic, but she was a survivor, and she was a fighter. And part of the way that she was a survivor and a fighter was by not dwelling on the emotional repercussions of the trauma. Yeah.
I think there was someone over on this side, yes.
So you chose to write a book about your family, and you have daughters. Can you speak to how you relate to them, this family history, whether they have read the book or will read the book, and can you imagine them writing a book sometime about you?
I hope not. I really hope not. My older daughter has read about half of the book. She's 12, and I was worried about her reading it for a while because there's some really ugly material in there. But I thought she was probably ready, and she seems ready, and it's meant a lot to her. She was very, very close to my mother and quite traumatized by the death of my mother. And so it felt almost important for her to read it. With my younger daughter, I've taken a more oral approach to all of this and have sort of told her stories in a playful way, and in a almost kind of like a sing-songy way about my mother, about her mother, and everything my mother went through. And it's been an antidote, I think, to the sort of materialistic world that she's inhabiting here.
And our final question for the evening.
This is an easy one. Where in California were you raised, and where did you go to school?
I was raised mostly in Santa Monica, right here in Santa Monica Canyon, and some close friends who are from that neck of the woods are here, which is so nice to see. And I started in the little public school down in Santa Monica Canyon, but then busing started, where they were going to bus me to a school in Watts. And so my parents took the bus ride, and they felt it was too long, and so they put me into Curtis School, which then was in West Hollywood, and then I went to Marlboro. And then I went to Harvard. But I have a 7th grader at Marlboro now, so we're continuing that, for better or for worse. No, we're better. I love that school.
Hi. Sorry, I have a kind of unformed question. When I started reading your work, Ms. Smiley, it seemed like it really elevated, it was revelatory to me because it elevated a kind of female perspective, or quote unquote female perspective. It was telling stories about women, the way women talk, like gossiping. And now there's this story, which is about a ferocious woman in incredible, like not quite so subtle times. And I'm wondering whether you think that with the development of feminism and all that comes with, whether this is sort of a natural, what the relationship is between your work and at least your early work.
Well, I have no idea. I mean, as I said before, I just write it and put it out there and hope for the best. And I think that's essentially what most novelists do. They have something they must write about. They do it the best they can to shape it into a compelling narrative, and they put it out there. And whatever the reaction is, you cannot change that. You just have to accept that. But most readers of novels are women, and the publishers are aware of that. And so I think there is a kind of attempt on a lot of women authors to push the novels about women away from sort of the classic romantic style, or what maybe would be called chick lit, and towards something more serious. And well, you just do your best and hope for the best, and that's the way it is. And I think that one of the things I love about this book is the voice, the narrative voice, well, you know, I'd be really interested if the name on the book were C. Craig or Craig Charmaine.
Right.
To me, it seems like a female voice because it's so empathetic with everybody, every character. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about it. But it is, and you know, I hope for the best for this one too.
Well, thanks, ladies. Thank you all for coming.